The wind doesn't just howl here, it screams. It's a primal, soul-stripping sound that rips across the Yukon territory. A sound the native Tlingit people knew to respect. It's the sound of the mountain. And tonight, the mountain is angry. Our story begins in the winter of 1898, in the heart of the Klondike gold rush, a period defined by a mass migration of an estimated 100,000 prospectors seeking fortune. But this isn't a story about riches. It's about what a man will do for them, what he will betray. Imagine a world painted only in shades of white and gray. A blizzard rages, not just a storm, but a living entity, a swirling vortex of ice and fury. Snow doesn't fall, it attacks, driven horizontally by a gale that drops the temperature to 50, 60 degrees below zero. In this maelstrom, a lone figure stumbles forward. His name is Silas Blackwood. Every inch of him is covered in frost. His beard is a solid block of ice. His eyelashes are heavy with frozen tears, and the air he breathes feels like swallowing broken glass. But Silas doesn't feel the cold. Not really. He is insulated by a fever, not of the body, but of the soul. Gold fever. A manic obsession that drove thousands to this desolate corner of the world. Clutched to his chest, beneath layers of wool and furs, is a heavy set of leather pouches. They don't contain survival gear. They contain his future, his fortune. A fortune that, just hours ago, belonged to another man, his partner. The man he left for dead in a small, snowbound cabin miles behind him. Silas believes he's committed the perfect crime. He'll let the storm cover his tracks. By the time the spring thaw comes, he'll be 1,000 miles away, a wealthy man, and his partner, Liam, will be just another nameless soul claimed by the unforgiving Klondike. But Silas is forgetting one crucial detail. In the Yukon, you are never truly alone. The creeks, the valleys, the towering peaks, they watch. They remember. He stole his partner's gold in a blizzard, believing he could conquer the wild. He was about to learn that the mountain had other plans. Our story doesn't begin in the snow, but in the mud and grime of Seattle, a year earlier. The city was electric, buzzing with a single word: gold. On July 17th, 1897, the steamship SS Portland had docked, carrying, as the Seattle Post-Intelligencer famously screamed, more than a ton of gold. That news ignited a firestorm of ambition across the nation. In a smoky tavern, amidst the cacophony of excited chatter, we find two men, different as night and day, bound by a shared dream. Liam O'Connell was a young Irishman, barely 20, with a quick smile and hands calloused from working the railroads. He saw the Klondike not just as a path to wealth, but as the grand adventure his soul craved. He was an optimist, a believer in the good of people. Across from him sat Silas Blackwood, older, quieter, with eyes that seemed to have seen too much of the world's hardships. He was a farmer from the Dakotas who had lost everything to drought and debt. For Silas, the Klondike wasn't an adventure, it was a last, desperate gamble. He was pragmatic, reserved, and had learned early on that trust was a currency you spent at your own peril. They met on the docks, two men among thousands, and formed a partnership out of necessity. The Canadian authorities, Specifically, the Northwest Mounted Police had a rule designed to prevent mass starvation. Every man entering the Yukon had to bring a year's worth of supplies. This amounted to nearly a ton of gear: flour, bacon, beans, tools, clothing, a tent. It was a staggering weight, an impossible burden for one man. "Together," Liam had said, extending a hand to Silas, "we can move a mountain." Silas, after a long, calculating pause, shook it. A pact was made. They pooled their meager savings, bought their ton of goods, and joined the Great Stampede north. Their chosen path was the notorious Chilkoot Trail, a 33-mile ordeal that began in the coastal town of Daya. It was known as the poor man's route because you could, in theory, haul your own gear without expensive pack animals. The reality was a waking nightmare. The trail was a brutal, vertical climb. To move their ton of supplies across the pass, they had to employ a tactic known as the stage system. They would carry a 50 or 60-pound pack a few miles up the trail, drop it, and then hike all the way back down to pick up the next load. To move their entire outfit 1 mile forward, they had to walk 80 miles back and forth. Days blurred into a monotonous cycle of grueling labor. Their muscles screamed, their backs ached, and their spirits frayed. They saw other partnerships dissolve into bitter arguments and even fistfights on the trail. But Liam and Silas endured. Liam's boundless energy seemed to buoy Silas's cynicism. When Silas slipped on a slick rock, nearly sending a precious sack of flour into a ravine, it was Liam's hand that shot out and grabbed him. When Liam was struck with a debilitating bout of dysentery, Silas nursed him back to health with willow bark tea, a remedy learned from his grandfather. The final ascent of the Chilkoot Pass was a place that would forever be etched in their memories: the Golden Stairs. It was a staircase of 1,500 steps cut directly into the ice and snow of the summit, so steep and narrow that men could only move in a single, agonizingly slow file line. For hours they stood in this frozen queue, each step a monumental effort, the wind threatening to peel them from the mountainside. It was here, sharing a frozen biscuit and watching the endless line of determined faces, that Liam turned to Silas. "We'll remember this, Silas," he'd said, his breath fogging in the frigid air. "When we're rich men, sitting by a warm fire, we'll tell stories about this, the day we climbed a staircase to the top of the world." Silas had only grunted, his eyes fixed on the summit. But a bond had been forged in that crucible of ice and exhaustion. It wasn't just a partnership anymore. They were brothers, tested by the trail, their fates intertwined. They had conquered the mountain together. Or so they thought. After conquering the pass, they, along with thousands of others, spent weeks at the shores of Lake Bennett, felling trees to build a crude boat that would take them on the final 500-mile leg of their journey down the Yukon River. The river itself was a new set of dangers, with treacherous rapids like the Miles Canyon, but they navigated it successfully, their shared ordeal on the trail having honed them into an efficient team. And then they saw it. Dawson City. From a distance, it looked like a promised land, but as they drew closer, the reality set in. Dawson, in the summer of 1898, was less a city and more a chaotic, sprawling camp of 17,000 souls, built on a muddy swamp at the confluence of the Klondike and Yukon rivers. The streets were quagmires of mud so deep they could swallow a man's boot. The air was thick with the smoke of wood stoves, the buzz of 1,000,000 mosquitoes, and the constant sound of hammers and saws as new, hastily constructed buildings were thrown up. Front Street was a riot of humanity. Grizzled prospectors, hopeful newcomers, gamblers, saloon girls, and con men like the infamous Soapy Smith who preyed on the naive. Everything ran on gold. A simple meal of eggs and bacon could cost the equivalent of a week's wages back home. A dance with a girl at the Tivoli Theater cost a pinch of gold dust. The saloons were packed day and night, with men spending their newfound wealth as fast as they dug it out of the ground. Liam was dazzled by the energy of the place, the raw, untamed capitalism. Silas, however, saw only the desperation beneath the surface. He saw the loneliness in the miners' eyes, the predatory gleam in the gamblers' smiles. They staked the claim on a small, overlooked fraction of a creek called Last Chance, a tributary of the famous Bonanza Creek where the rush began. Most believed it was worthless, already picked over. And for months, it seemed they were right. The work was brutal, a type of placer mining dictated by the Yukon's permafrost. Because the ground was frozen solid, they had to spend the long, dark winter months digging. Their method was painstaking. They'd build a fire at the bottom of a shaft to thaw about a foot of earth. Then they'd shovel out the thawed gravel, the pay dirt, and hoist it to the surface where it would instantly freeze again into a solid pile. It was slow, dangerous work. The fumes from the fires could be deadly, and the melting permafrost could cause the shaft to collapse without warning. Through that first winter, they toiled in near-total darkness, their world confined to the claustrophobic shaft and their small, drafty cabin. Liam fought off the gloom with stories of what they'd do with their fortune. He'd buy his mother a house, sail the world, maybe even start his own company. Silas rarely spoke of the future. He just worked, his movements economical, his face a grim mask of determination. The silence of the mines began to change him. Days were spent in near isolation, the only sounds the scrape of their shovels and the crackle of the thawing fires. He started watching Liam. He noticed how Liam would sometimes discard a pan of gravel a little too quickly, or how he'd take an extra minute of rest at the top of the shaft. Suspicion, like a cancer, began to grow in the dark corners of Silas's mind. Was Liam pulling his weight? Did he want the gold as badly as Silas needed it? Then, in the late spring, as the creeks began to thaw, they started the second phase of their operation, sluicing the massive pile of frozen pay dirt they had accumulated. Using a long, inclined wooden trough called a sluice box, they washed the gravel with creek water. The heavy gold flakes and nuggets would get trapped behind small barriers called riffles, while the lighter sand and rock washed away. For weeks they found nothing but dust, barely enough to pay for their beans and bacon. Despair began to set in. Liam's optimism started to crack, but Silas's resolve only hardened. And then, one afternoon, it happened. Liam let out a whoop that echoed through the valley. At the bottom of the sluice box, nestled in the riffles, was not dust, but a collection of gleaming, pea-sized nuggets, and below them a thick, heavy line of pure gold. They had hit a rich deposit, a pocket of the creek bed that everyone else had missed. That first day they recovered over 10 pounds of gold. The next day, 15. Within a week, they had amassed a fortune beyond their wildest dreams. The weight of it was intoxicating. Liam laughed, he sang, he danced a jig on the muddy bank of the creek. He saw their partnership vindicated, their brotherhood rewarded. Silas, however, felt a different emotion. As he held a heavy nugget in the palm of his hand, its density and warmth feeling almost alive, a cold, possessive thought slithered into his heart. Mine. He looked at Liam, who was already talking about booking passage on the first steamship back to Seattle, and he didn't see a brother. He saw an obstacle. He saw a man who was entitled to half of his gold. The gold fever, which had been a dull ache, had now become a raging inferno in his blood.
It twisted his memories of the Chilkoot, recasting Liam's help not as friendship, but as a debt that was now paid. Dawson City, with its culture of raw, selfish ambition, had corroded the bond they had forged on the trail. The mountain had tested their strength, but the gold was testing their souls, and Silas's soul was beginning to fail.
The shift in Silas was subtle at first, like a change in the wind before a storm. He became withdrawn, his silence growing deeper, heavier. He'd spend hours just running the gold through his fingers, his eyes distant. When Liam spoke of their plans to leave, Silas would offer non-committal grunts or change the subject. He started meticulously weighing and bagging the gold, insisting on keeping it all in his possession, claiming he was better organized. Liam, blinded by his own joy and his unwavering trust in the man who had saved his life, saw it only as Silas's typical cautious nature. The plan for the betrayal began to form in Silas's mind as the autumn nights grew longer and the first snows began to dust the peaks. He knew he couldn't simply murder Liam and take the gold. The Northwest Mounted Police in Dawson were ruthlessly efficient, and a violent crime would be investigated thoroughly. No, it had to look like an accident, an act of God. The weather gave him his opportunity. An old Tlingit trader passing through their camp warned them of a Wendigo storm coming, a blizzard of unusual ferocity, the kind that could last for days and swallow a man whole. While Liam saw it as a sign to hunker down and wait, Silas saw it as a divine invitation. The night before the storm hit, the air was unnaturally still and cold. A strange pale light hung in the sky. Inside their cabin, Liam was in high spirits, poring over a map and tracing their route back to civilization. 2 more weeks, Silas, and we'll be drinking real whiskey in a warm hotel in Skagray. No more boiled beans for us. Silas watched him, his heart a cold, hard stone in his chest. He had found a small pouch of laudanum in Dawson, sold as a painkiller, and he knew its potent, sleep-inducing effects. He busied himself making their final pot of coffee, his back to Liam. His hands didn't even tremble as he uncorked the small vial and poured a generous amount into Liam's cup. "A toast," Silas said, handing the mug to Liam. "To the Klondike. It was hard on us, but it made us rich." Liam, smiling, clinked his mug against Silas's. "To us, partner. We did it." He drank the coffee down, grimacing slightly at the bitter taste. "You put too much chicory in this, Silas," he joked, before yawning. "Strange, all that work, and I wasn't tired until just now." Within minutes, Liam's words began to slur. His head grew heavy. He looked at Silas, a flicker of confusion in his eyes, before slumping forward onto the table, unconscious. The first flakes of snow began to whisper against the cabin's single window pane. Silas worked with a chilling efficiency. He didn't waste a moment. He packed all the gold, almost 200 pounds of it, into sturdy leather sacks, distributing the weight into a heavy pack for his back and 2 more bags to be clutched in his hands. He took the lion's share of the preserved food, leaving Liam with almost nothing. He then dragged Liam from the chair and placed him in his bunk, pulling a thin blanket over him. To any observer, it would look as if the man had simply gone to sleep. Finally, Silas stepped to the door and paused. He looked back at the man who had climbed the golden stairs with him, the man whose life he had saved, the man who called him brother. For a fleeting second, a pang of something, maybe guilt, regret, pricked at him. He saw Liam shiver in his drugged sleep. Silas snuffed it out. He hardened his heart, the fever for the gold burning away the last vestiges of his humanity. He stepped out of the cabin and into the burgeoning storm, pulling the door shut, but not barring it. He wanted it to look like Liam might have wandered out on his own. The wind was already picking up, swirling the snow into ghostly dancers in the twilight. Silas pulled his fur cap down, leaned into the gale, and set his course south, toward the mountain pass that would lead him to the coast and to his new life. The snow quickly covered his tracks, erasing his presence, erasing his crime. He was a ghost in the white wilderness, weighed down with gold, and utterly, terrifyingly alone.
The first few hours were a triumph. The sheer weight of the gold was immense, a brutal burden that dug into his shoulders and strained his every muscle, but Silas felt only its promise. Each painful step was a step towards a new identity, a world away from the dirt and failure of his past. The storm, which he had seen as his accomplice, was a wall of white that shielded him from the world, from judgment, from Liam. But the mountain pass was not the same as the trail he had ascended. The blizzard was a disorienting, deafening force. There was no path, no landmarks, just an endless shifting sea of white. The wind drove the snow with such power that it scoured any tracks he made within seconds. After what he thought was half a day of walking, he stopped, panting, and realized with a jolt of fear that he couldn't be sure if he was still heading south. He could be walking in circles. The cold, which he had ignored, now began to seep into his bones. It was a predatory cold, a living thing that gnawed at his extremities. His fingers, wrapped around the leather straps of the gold pouches, became numbed, clumsy claws. His feet were heavy, unfeeling blocks of ice. The gold fever that had warmed him was now being replaced by the insidious creeping hypothermia. Panic began to set in. He cursed, his voice swallowed by the wind. He tried to think, to remember the map he had studied, but his thoughts were becoming sluggish, thick as molasses. The world had shrunk to the few feet of swirling snow in front of his face. And then he started to hear things. At first, it was just a whisper on the wind, a sound that was almost Liam's voice. "Silas, where are you going, partner?" He spun around, seeing nothing but the white void. "It's the wind," he muttered to himself, his teeth chattering, "just the wind." But the whispers grew more distinct. He heard the scrape of a shovel on gravel, the sound they had made for months in the mine shaft. He heard the distant phantom laughter of the dance hall girls in Gossan. The sounds of the life he had betrayed, the world he had left behind, were now haunting him in the storm. He stumbled, falling face first into a deep drift. The impact was jarring. As he struggled to rise, the weight of the gold pack felt like a giant hand pushing him down, trying to bury him. For the first time, the gold felt not like a treasure, but a curse, an anchor. He thrashed wildly, finally managing to get to his knees, gasping for breath that wouldn't come. And when he looked up, he saw them. Ghostly figures, half-formed in the swirling snow, they were the faces of the Klondike's failures. Men with hollow eyes and frozen beards, their bodies thin and ragged. The men who had died on the trail, in the rapids, in the mines. They didn't speak, but their eyes condemned him. He saw the faces of men whose partnerships had soured, whose dreams had turned to dust. They lined his path, a silent, spectral jury. He screamed, a raw, terrified sound, and began to run. He blundered through the snow, no longer caring for direction, only escape. But the Cantums kept pace, and the voice of Liam was now clear as a bell right beside his ear. "We were brothers, Silas. We climbed the stairs together." The weight on his back was unbearable. He shrugged off the main pack, letting it fall into the snow. "I don't need it all," he shrieked at the wind, at the ghosts. He kept clutching the two pouches in his hands, his mind clinging to the idea that he could still escape with something. But the mountain was not done with him. The ground beneath his feet gave way. He had wandered onto a frozen cornice, an overhanging ledge of snow. With a sickening crack, it fractured. Silas cried out as he tumbled down a steep rocky embankment, his body battered and broken by the fall. He landed in a heap at the bottom, his leg twisted at an unnatural angle. A searing pain shot through him, sharp and absolute. His leg was broken. He tried to move, but the pain was blinding, nauseating. He was trapped. The storm raged around him, a relentless, indifferent force. The ghosts were gone. The voices were silent. There was only the wind and the white darkness. He lay there, the 2 pouches of gold still clutched in his frozen hands, their weight now feeling impossibly, ironically heavy. He looked up at the invisible sky, the snow stinging his eyes, and he finally understood. He had not been clever. He had not committed the perfect crime. He had been a fool. He thought he was using the storm, but the storm was using him. He thought he was stealing a fortune, but he had only purchased his own tomb. The mountain didn't need a plan. It simply needed to be itself. And its nature was cold, impartial, and deadly. Silas Blackwood's fever finally broke, replaced by the profound, ultimate cold of his own making. The blizzard raged for 3 days. Inside the cabin at Last Chance Creek, Liam O'Connell drifted in and out of a drugged, feverish sleep. He awoke on the 4th day to a world of blinding white light and profound silence. The storm had passed. His head throbbed, his mouth was as dry as dust, and a deep, unnatural chill had settled into his bones. He stumbled out of his bunk, his legs unsteady. The cabin felt hollow, empty. He saw the dregs in his coffee mug and the empty space where the sacks of gold should have been, and he knew. The realization didn't come with anger at first, but with a deep, crushing sorrow. It was a betrayal so complete it felt like a physical blow. He searched the cabin and found the empty laudanum vial. It wasn't an accident. It wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a calculated act of treachery. Liam survived the next few weeks on sheer will. Silas had left him with scant supplies, but Liam was resourceful. He set snares, fished through holes in the ice, and endured. The loneliness was a heavier burden than the hunger. He was haunted not by the loss of the gold, but by the loss of his friend. He replayed every moment of their journey, every shared hardship, searching for the moment Silas had changed, the moment the brother he knew had died. Spring arrived late that year, in a slow, muddy, and messy thaw. The snow receded, revealing the scarred landscape and the detritus of the winter. Other prospectors began moving through the passes again. It was a pair of them heading to Dawson who found him. They found Silas Blackwood not far from the trail, at the bottom of a rocky slope. He was frozen solid, his body contorted. The expression on his face was one of wide-eyed terror. And in his hands, locked in a death grip so tight they had to be broken, were 2 heavy leather pouches. The main pack lay half buried in the snow nearby. Word travels fast in the Yukon. Liam heard the news from a Mountie who came to his claim to ask questions. The officer described the scene, the broken leg, the look on Silas's face. He confirmed all the gold had been recovered. "It's all yours, son," the Mountie said, not unkindly. "A terrible business. Some men just aren't built for this land. The gold gets in their blood." Liam took no pleasure in the news. He felt no sense of victory or justice. He arranged for Silas's body to be buried in the simple frozen cemetery outside Dawson, a place filled with thousands of other broken dreams. He paid for a simple wooden marker that bore only a name and a date. He stood before the grave for a long time. The 200 pounds of gold sat in the bank at Dawson, legally his. He was a rich man, the dream he and Silas had chased, now a reality for him alone. But the wealth felt like ash in his mouth. He didn't stay in the Klondike. He sold the claim, packed his gear, and bought passage on the first steamship heading south. As he stood on the deck, watching the jagged, snow-capped peaks of the Yukon fade into the distance, he didn't feel like a victor. He felt like a survivor. The Klondike gold rush was a fever that drew over 100,000 people to the north. A few, like Liam, found their fortune. Most found only hardship, and some, like Silas, found a far darker fate. They learned that the hunger for gold can cause a man to betray everything he holds dear, even his own soul. But they also learned that in the vast, silent wilderness of the North, there are older, more powerful forces than greed. Liam O'Connell had lost a brother, but he had learned a lesson he would carry for the rest of his life. You can't conquer the mountain. You can only hope it lets you pass, and it never, ever forgets.